Well, sadly, the answer to that question is yes. Our political debate can always sink lower, as former Greens Senator Lydia Thorpe showed us last week.
Any black man that stands with a white little like that, you can all get too.
Now, apart from slamming Thorpe, last week I showed you how assiduously the ABC had ignored that story, censored it effectively. The ABC's failure to fulfil its charter was just so obvious and so indefensible that the ABC's Media Watch program last night couldn't help slapping it down.
But by midweek, attention was turning to how the national broadcaster was reporting the fracas. Or not, as it turned out, with claims the ABC was censoring a major news story.
We know if this was a politician of the right, the video would have been on constant loop at the ABC.
If this was a male, Liberal politician outside a strip club shouting profanities about a woman's genitals at 3 a.m, you know this would be a prominent story on the public broadcaster.
Hard to disagree with that. And were the critics right? Was the ABC staying mum? Answer, yes. Aside from some brief mentions, there was nothing in an ABC News bulletin or online. And that is pathetic, given that it's the ABC's job to hold our elected representatives to account.
Good for Media Watch, hey? But of course, having refused to deny the obvious, in this case, they needed to get back into their News Corp bashing, and there was a hell of a story for them to do that with.
But now, let's go to the biggest and best news of the week. Fox's billion-dollar mistake was to help spread President Trump's big lie that the 2020 election was stolen from him, pointing the finger at Dominion and its voting machines.
The best story? Really? It certainly was a big story, and as I and others always said here, those election-stealing allegations were always wild, and even though they were being made by a sitting president and his senior counsel, they needed to be interrogated and challenged and exposed, as they were by many, but not by all. Trump's election denial goes on, of course, but the fact people within Fox News were concerned about it highlights the editorial autonomy of its commentators, rather than the left's usual charge of dictated conformity. Anyway, while Media Watch is into false claims, conspiracies, big stories and corrections, I thought we should remind them of this.
Hello and welcome to Four Corners. Tonight we begin our special three-part investigation into the story of the century, the election of US President Donald Trump and his ties to Russia. The Kremlin's puppet master now has America dancing to his discordant tune. He couldn't have planned it better.
Ah, the story of the century. I remember that modest claim, a three-part series to boot. So how did that all turn out?
Well, tonight's big story nationally, a summary of Special Counsel Robert Mueller's report says the investigation did not find the president's campaign conspired with Russia.
The 4-page letter reads, the special counsel's investigation did not find that the Trump campaign or anyone associated with it conspired or coordinated with Russia in its efforts to influence the 2016 U.S. presidential election.
But hang on, what happened to the story of the century and all those big names?
James Clapper was Obama's Director of National Intelligence, the most senior intelligence official in the US during the election campaign.
They clearly were interested the Russians were, I think, in penetrating the Trump campaign.
You saw your nation convulsed by division caused by the Watergate scandal. How does this compare?
Oh, I think what's going on now makes that pale. That was purely a domestic thing. We didn't have an involvement of a foreign adversary, or prime foreign adversary, Russia, in that. And so to me, it's much more worrisome.
Bigger than Watergate, hey? A lefty dream, but as it transpires, based on no evidence, as revealed 3 years ago when the House Intelligence Committee released transcripts and Clapper's testimony said he never saw any direct empirical evidence that the Trump campaign or someone in it was plotting or conspiring with the Russians to meddle with the election. He said that's not to say there weren't concerns about anecdotal evidence, but he didn't recall any instance where he had direct evidence. Wow, but it was all good enough for Ferguson, Four Corners and the ABC. Will Media Watch ever admit that this was the ABC's most expensive charade? That the story of the century was actually the stuff-up of the century? The misleading conspiracy theory of the century? You can still see these episodes unaltered on the ABC's website, still boasting that they were months in the making, filmed around the world, with an extraordinary story that could have been lifted from a blockbuster spy novel. Indeed, a blockbuster fiction novel. Perhaps the reason Media Watch's Paul Barry doesn't want to expose the ABC's Russia obsession is because he was into it too.
Tonight, in a special programme, we're going to look at how Facebook and Twitter allowed their platforms to be used by Russia to swing the US presidential election and divide America. It would not have needed much. Trump won the presidency by a handful of votes in a few swing states. And we don't yet know the full extent of Russian interference.
Yeah, that looks a lot like election denial, doesn't it? Same denial, different side of politics. We eagerly await the ABC's corrections and apologies, admitting that it clearly was not Vladimir Putin who installed Donald Trump in the White House. Don't hold your breath.